JD Vance pulled off the highway, his headlights cutting through the early evening haze as he eased into the parking lot of Ruston Grill, a small roadside diner just outside Ruston, Louisiana. It was the kind of place he had always been drawn to. Nothing flashy, just a well-worn establishment with a faded sign above the entrance and a row of pickup trucks parked out front. The neon "Open" sign flickered slightly, and through the large front window he could see a handful of customers hunched over their meals, the warm glow of hanging bulbs casting long shadows on the checkered tile floor. JD had spent the day meeting with local business owners and community leaders, discussing everything from job opportunities to the struggles of small-town economies. It had been a long day, longer than he expected, and all he wanted now was a simple meal before making the drive back. A local had recommended Ruston Grill, swearing by their homemade gumbo and hand-cut fries, and that was enough to convince him. As he stepped out of his car and approached the entrance, he took in the familiar scents of a place like this: fried catfish, grilled burgers, and the unmistakable bitterness of strong black coffee. It was the smell of long hours and honest work. He pushed open the glass door, and the bell above jingled softly. Inside, the diner was compact but inviting. A row of red leather booths lined one side, with a long counter running parallel to them. A few customers were scattered throughout. An older trucker sipping coffee at the counter, a young couple sharing a plate of fries, and a group of middle-aged men in oil-stained work shirts chatting quietly in the back. A jukebox hummed in the corner, playing an old country tune. At first, JD felt at ease. This was his kind of place, unpretentious, real. But as he stepped further inside, he noticed a shift in the air. Conversation slowed. A man in a camo jacket glanced up from his burger, recognition flickering in his eyes before he leaned in to whisper something to his companion. A woman near the window set her coffee cup down a little too hard, her gaze lingering on him for a second too long before looking away. Behind the counter, Linda, a waitress in her late 50s, greeted him with an automatic smile, but the moment her eyes fully registered who he was, that smile faltered, replaced by something unreadable. It was only for a second, but JD caught it. The hesitation, the uncertainty, something wasn't right. JD Vance had spent enough time in rooms where he wasn't welcome to recognize the signs. The subtle shift in atmosphere, the sudden quiet, the sidelong glances. He had felt it before, and he felt it now. But this was a diner, a simple roadside stop in Ruston, Louisiana. He wasn't here to campaign, to debate, or to push an agenda. He just wanted a meal. The waitress, Linda, had hesitated the moment she recognized him. She had been ready with the usual greeting, a tired but polite "What can I get ya?" But then her expression changed. Her grip on the order pad tightened, her smile faltered, and instead she said something different. "Dine in or take out?" It was a small shift, but JD caught it. The way her voice had flattened, the way her gaze flickered toward the kitchen. He kept his tone light, casual. "Dine in, if that's all right?" The pause was too long for a simple request. Linda glanced over her shoulder, toward the order window, where JD could now see Ray, the owner. A thick-built man in a grease-stained apron, his arms folded as he watched the exchange from behind the counter. The moment he saw JD standing there, his expression hardened. JD had seen that look before. This wasn't about the kitchen being backed up. This wasn't about short-staffing. This was personal. Linda turned back, her voice uncertain. "Let me check something real quick." She disappeared through the swinging door. JD exhaled slowly, glancing around the diner. A woman near the window had set down her fork, but she wasn't eating. She was listening. Across the room, a younger man in a hoodie leaned back in his booth, a smug smirk playing at his lips. JD wasn't naive. He had options. He could leave, shake his head, pretend this didn't bother him, or he could press the issue, call them out, make sure they knew exactly how bad this would look if it hit the morning news. But he did neither. He just waited. Linda came out first, but Ray followed close behind, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't ask JD what he wanted. He didn't even pretend to be polite. He just got straight to the point. "I'm sorry," Ray said, voice firm. "We can't serve you tonight." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The diner wasn't silent, but it was close. The low hum of conversation had dulled. The clinking of silverware against plates had slowed. People were listening. JD studied Ray's face. He wasn't angry, just decided. This wasn't about a policy. It wasn't about business. JD let out a breath, measured. "Did I do something wrong?" Ray didn't fidget. "We'd just rather not serve you." No further explanation, no excuse, just a line drawn in the sand. From the booth near the window, the younger man in the hoodie let out a short, amused laugh. "Man, this is wild." JD ignored him. His attention stayed on Ray. "All right," JD said. "Then can I speak with the owner?" That got a reaction. The trucker at the counter muttered something under his breath. The woman near the window shifted uncomfortably. Even Linda, who had kept her face carefully neutral, looked away. Ray exhaled. "That'd be me." JD nodded once. "Then I'd like to understand why." The younger guy scoffed. "Oh, come on, it's not that deep, man. You're just not welcome here." JD turned slightly, considering him. The guy looked like someone who enjoyed a fight, someone who was waiting for JD to react, to get angry, to make a scene. But JD didn't bite. He just looked back at Ray. "Look," Ray said, rubbing the back of his neck. "People around here got their opinions about you, about what you stand for. I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." JD nodded, absorbing that. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Ray hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the counter, toward the trucker who was still chewing his food, but a little slower now. A few booths away, the woman near the window was staring at her untouched plate. Others were pretending not to listen, but their body language said otherwise. JD had seen this before. It wasn't about one decision, it was about what that decision meant. JD exhaled again. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" For the first time, something shifted in Ray's face. Discomfort, a hesitation, a crack. And just as Ray was about to answer, the younger guy in the booth let out another sharp laugh. "Man, this ain't a debate. You're just not welcome here, simple as that." JD turned toward him, studied him, and then, instead of arguing, instead of pushing back, he simply pulled out a chair and sat down. The room tensed. JD didn't slam the chair down. He didn't puff up his chest or raise his voice. He just sat, resting his hands on the table, like he had all the time in the world. The diner had expected JD to leave. That was the normal response. People didn't argue when they were told they weren't welcome. They left. JD didn't. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations that had already been low dropped to a hush. A coffee cup clinked against the counter just a little too loudly. Ray, the owner, sighed heavily, tossing the rag in his hands onto the counter. He had expected JD to walk out, maybe shoot back a sarcastic remark before he did, but instead the man had settled in, like he wasn't going anywhere. JD met his gaze, steady and calm. "Talk," he said. "Tell me why." Ray didn't move at first, but the real pressure was coming from the customers, the silent ones, the ones pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. Ray sighed again. "I run a business," he muttered. "I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines. But I got a community to think about." JD nodded slightly. "All right, so tell me, what does this community think about me?" Ray hesitated. "They don't trust politicians." His voice was firm but weary. "And some of the things you've said, the things you stood for, they don't sit right with folks here." JD leaned back a little, absorbing that. "Fair enough. But you don't know me, do you?" Ray crossed his arms. "Not personally, no." JD tilted his head. "Then tell me this. If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, Would we even be having this conversation? Before Ray could answer, a sharp laugh came from the booth near the window. "This isn't about TV, man." The younger guy in the hoodie smirked, leaning forward. "It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "And who am I?" The guy grinned like he had been waiting for that question. "You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics just like everyone else." JD didn't flinch. He nodded slightly. "All right, then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The younger man's smirk faded just a little. He had been expecting a fight, not an invitation. "You want me gone?" JD continued. "Fine, but you've got the floor. Say what you need to say." Silence. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. No plates clinking, no orders being called out, just waiting. Ray ran a hand over his face. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD offered a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But something was shifting. The tension wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about something deeper. People weren't just watching now. They were thinking. JD stayed patient. Ray finally broke the silence. "You want to know what people think?" he asked. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't react, didn't argue. He just tilted his head, waiting for more. "They think you talk about working class folks, but you still play the game, that you make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Ray exhaled sharply. "And people don't forget." JD nodded. "I get that." The younger guy scoffed. "That's it? That's all you're going to say?" JD turned toward him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened slightly. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself, say something." JD leaned forward, voice steady. "You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad, wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified." The younger guy's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. JD looked back at Ray. "You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people never expected me to do. But that doesn't mean I forgot." Ray's fingers tapped against the chair in front of him. His expression wasn't dismissive anymore. It was thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. "You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician. Just a guy looking for a meal." A pause. Then from the counter, the old trucker muttered, "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." The tension cracked. Just slightly, a few people smirked. Even Ray let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. "So, what now?" Ray exhaled, looking toward the kitchen. The cooks were still watching. The customers were still waiting. Finally, he sighed. "You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD. Something in the room had shifted. The initial hostility had softened into something else, something closer to curiosity, maybe even understanding. JD could feel it. He didn't move, didn't press the moment too hard. Instead, he let the silence settle, let the weight of the conversation linger, let them sit with their own thoughts for a second. Across from him, Ray was still standing, arms crossed over his chest. He looked at JD like he was trying to figure something out. From the counter, the old trucker stirred his coffee slowly, his weathered fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug. He hadn't said much all night, but he had been listening, really listening. And now, after a long pause, he muttered loud enough for the room to hear, "Been a long time since I seen a politician sit down and actually listen." Ray exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. His jaw was still tight, his posture still stiff. But there was something different in his eyes now. He turned toward Linda, the waitress, who had been standing frozen near the register. She hesitated, Then, finally, she reached for a laminated menu and walked over. She set it down on the table in front of JD without a word. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it wasn't nothing either. JD glanced up at her. "Appreciate it." She gave a small, tight nod, then walked back behind the counter. The younger guy in the hoodie, still seated in his booth, scoffed, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "So, that's it? He just stays?" Ray looked at him, then back at JD, his fingers tapped against his forearm like he was weighing something in his mind. "All right," Ray said, voice low. "Since you're here, tell me something." JD set the menu down. "What's that?" Ray tilted his head slightly. "You ever had this happen before?" JD thought about that for a moment. Not just being turned away, he was a politician after all. Plenty of people disagreed with him, plenty of places weren't welcome. That wasn't new. But this was different. This wasn't some protest outside an event, some online outrage over a statement he made. This was about people, real people in a real place, telling him to his face that they didn't trust him. "Not like this," JD admitted. Ray nodded, like that answer made sense. "And yet, you stayed." JD shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. Ray let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Most guys in your position would have walked out, maybe raised hell, called a lawyer, made sure this place was all over the news by morning." "Ha ha ha," JD smirked. "Thought about it?" Ray actually laughed at that. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real, and for the first time all night it felt like the tension had cracked just a little more. From behind the counter, Linda poured a fresh cup of coffee and brought it over. She didn't say anything, just set it down next to JD. JD took a sip, raising an eyebrow. "You make it strong here." A few people chuckled. Linda muttered, "You'll live." The diner felt different now. Not completely changed. There were still people in the room who weren't sold on him, still people who probably wished he had left, but the edges of their hostility had softened, replaced with something closer to curiosity. Ray looked at JD, drumming his fingers on the table. "You're not going to change everyone's mind." JD nodded. "I know." Ray sighed, rubbing his face. "And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning." JD grinned. "That's fair." From the counter, the old trucker took another sip of coffee. "Still a damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." JD turned toward him. "I think that's about to change." Ray sighed, pushing himself up from the table. He looked toward the kitchen where the cooks were still standing, waiting for a signal. Finally, he gave them a nod. "All right, boys," Ray called. "Fire up the grill." A ripple of surprise passed through the diner. The younger guy in the booth let out a short, disbelieving scoff, but he didn't argue. Linda disappeared into the back, and the sound of sizzling meat filled the air. JD leaned back in his chair, watching as the atmosphere shifted once again. The sizzling of the grill filled the diner, blending with the soft murmur of conversation that had begun to rebuild itself. The tense, uneasy silence from earlier was gone, replaced by something more natural, something less rigid. People still had their opinions, their doubts, but for now, they were listening. JD sat back, sipping his coffee as Linda placed a plate in front of him. He picked up the burger, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then after a pause he wiped his mouth and said, "Little dry." For half a second the diner was still. Then Ray let out a deep laugh, shaking his head. "Or a piece of work." A few others chuckled, the tension cracking just a little more. Even the young guy in the hoodie, who had been the loudest critic earlier, was watching differently now. He wasn't smiling, wasn't agreeing, but he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. As JD finished his meal, the diner started to feel like a diner again. Forks clinked against plates, coffee cups were refilled, and people settled back into their routines. Not everyone had changed their mind about him. Some never would. But for one night, in one small town, something different had happened. Because in a world where everyone is ready to argue, sometimes the real power is in staying, listening, and proving that not everything has to be a fight. What do you think? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you.